Pastor Andrew Brunson has been released from detention in Turkey. He was held for 2 years on accusations of backing an attempted coup in 2016. RT correspondent Dan Cohen has the latest.
The case of Pastor Andrew Brunson has been a sticking point between the U.S. and Turkey, but he's said to be back on U.S. soil as early as Friday night. A Turkish court convicted Brunson of aiding terrorism, and while he originally faced up to 35 years in prison, he was sentenced to 2 years of time served and released immediately. Minutes after the verdict, President Trump wrote on Twitter, "Pastor Brunson just released, will be home soon." Brunson's attorney in Turkey said he will return to the United States and resume a normal life.
Of course it's upsetting that he was convicted, but in terms of him being freed, we think that's a positive development. When you look at what he was charged with and the long sentence he faced, he was sentenced to 3 years and 1 month, but the time he has already served covers that. Now we'll exercise our right to appeal, but the most important thing to us is that he has been freed.
American-Turkish relations have deteriorated since the failed coup in 2016, which Ankara accused Washington of having a hand in. Tensions were exacerbated by American support for Kurdish militias in Syria. Ankara regards them as an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which it considers a terrorist group. After President Erdogan agreed to purchase the S-400 missile defense system from Moscow, the Trump administration froze the sale of 100 F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. The U.S. imposed sanctions on 2 top Turkish officials and imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, sending the Turkish lira spiraling and setting off protests against the U.S. Erdogan remained defiant, calling for a boycott of American products and saying he would never release Brunson. This comes as Turkish authorities claim to have evidence that Saudi Arabia murdered and dismembered journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So while the fallout from the disappearance of Khashoggi continues, Brunson's release may be a signal that Turkish-U.S. relations are warming, at least for now. Reporting in Washington, Dan Cohen, RT.
Turkish officials claim they have audio and video evidence that confirms that Jamal Khashoggi was brutally killed during his visit to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul just over a week ago. The Washington Post reported late Thursday U.S. officials are aware of the recordings that show that 15 members of Saudi intelligence officers tortured Khashoggi, killed him, and dismembered his body on October the 2nd. According to the flight's record, Saudi security team arrived early morning and left the country by the end of the day after murdering Washington Post columnist. Azam Tamimi, prominent Palestinian British activist and TV presenter, says he saw the journalist in London after Khashoggi's first visit in the consulate, just the day before he disappeared.
I was horrified because he assured me when we were in London that there was nothing to be concerned about. He said on Friday he had been to the consulate. They received him very well, although they were initially surprised to see him, and promised him if he came back again a few days later, they would issue him with the papers he was after. So he felt it was okay, but apparently they prepared a trap for him.
Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has denied any involvement in the disappearance of Khashoggi and called the allegations baseless. For more on this, we're joined by a former Pentagon official, Michael Maloof. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. Now, let's start with the pastor. He was released today, Andrew Brunson. He, along with over 20 other people, were detained after a failed coup back in 2016. He was charged with aiding terrorist groups and espionage and sentenced to 3 years. Was there any credible evidence to keep him detained?
So far, the information I've heard is that there was no credible evidence whatsoever. And the pastor always professed his innocence anyway. And I think the fact that after 2 years, no charges or evidence has come forward, I think politically, Erdogan probably made the political decision to let him go. Of course, he controls the courts pretty much, but it was important for him at this time because he was concerned about losing his F-35s, and he also had other economic issues. His lira was dropping, so he was trying to bring back the needle a little bit to get back in the good graces of the U.S. And then the Jamal Khashoggi deal happened. So this is all coming together all at once, complicating U.S.-Turkish relationships, Turkish-Saudi relationships, and now U.S.-Saudi relationships.
So back to Andrew. So you would say, you would agree that the U.S. imposed sanctions and trade tariffs on Turkey were the key that ultimately led to his release today?
It really had a major impact on the Turkish lira, absolutely. And the economy was going down very dramatically. And he had to do something because inflation was growing as well. And the central bank was losing out. So it was economically, he really had to do something rapidly.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, so the release today, it coincides with the disappearance of the journalist Khashoggi. Several reports claim Turkish officials have video and audio evidence that Khashoggi was killed inside the consulate in Istanbul, dismembered, and his body parts were taken out in boxes. This hasn't been proven, but several U.S. media outlets and companies have distanced themselves from Saudi Arabia and have withdrawn from a huge upcoming investment conference in Riyadh. Now, while the world waits to hear what happened to the journalist, what will come of the U.S.-Saudi relations?
Well, I think this is why President Trump has been very, very cautious. First of all, his entire Middle East policy hinges on a close U.S.-Saudi-Israeli relationship alliance. And if allegations prove to be true, I think that it's going to have a dramatic effect. You already have members of Congress who plan to introduce legislation to cut off arms sales. And that's a $100 billion deal, which is going to blossom into a $300 billion deal over the course of 10 years. So the stakes are very, very significant, and it could absolutely rupture Trump's Middle East policy altogether if the world does something. And I think it's also important that the world is watching Trump on what the U.S. reaction will be towards Saudi Arabia, because they generally will follow. So there will be a cascading impact, and I think the Trump administration realizes that if they take economic conditions against Saudi Arabia.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for your insight.
Pleasure.
That's former Pentagon official Michael Maloof.
Thank you.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.